Tonight we journey back to one of history's most haunting mysteries, the Franklin Expedition, a voyage of 129 men who sailed into the Arctic in 1845 and vanished without a trace. Imagine two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, fully provisioned with 3 years of supplies, steam engines, reinforced hulls, and the finest officers the Royal Navy could offer, disappearing into the frozen north as if swallowed by the ice itself. For years, the world wondered what became of Sir John Franklin and his crew. Search parties found only fragments, clues scattered across a desolate white wilderness. Tonight, we follow their journey from triumphant departure to mysterious disappearance. Before we begin, settle in. Whether you're joining from North America, Europe, or anywhere else in the world, no matter the time, this story will unfold slowly, like ice revealing its secrets one layer at a time. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe if you enjoy these historical journeys, and share a comment. Maybe tell us where you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. Now, prepare yourself, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind wander back more than 170 years as we step quietly into one of the greatest mysteries ever to emerge from the frozen Arctic. The morning of the 19th of May, 1845, dawned bright and hopeful along the River Thames. London hummed with excitement as crowds gathered along the docks at Greenhithe, their faces turned toward two magnificent ships, preparing to depart on an expedition that would capture the imagination of the entire British Empire. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sat proudly in the water, their hulls gleaming, their masts reaching toward the spring sky, their decks bustling with final preparations. Sir John Franklin stood on the deck of HMS Erebus, a distinguished figure at 59 years old, his naval uniform crisp and proper, his bearing that of a man who had dedicated his life to exploration and service. Around him, 128 other men, officers, sailors, engineers, and scientists moved with purpose and efficiency, securing provisions, checking equipment, and preparing for a journey that was expected to take 3 years. The air was filled with the sounds of activity, boots on wooden decks, orders called out clearly, the creak of ropes being tightened, the splash of water against hulls. Families stood on the docks, waving handkerchiefs, calling out final farewells. Wives clutched the hands of children who would grow significantly older before seeing their fathers again, if all went according to plan. Mothers watched sons disappear into the unknown, pride mingling with worry in their eyes. The scene was both jubilant and poignant, a celebration of British ambition and maritime excellence, tinged with the understanding that Arctic exploration carried inherent dangers. Franklin himself appeared confident, even serene. This was not his first venture into the frozen north. He had led previous Arctic expeditions, earning the nickname the Man Who Ate His Boots after a harrowing overland journey in 1819, where starvation had driven his party to desperate measures. That experience had made him famous, a survivor, a man who could endure the unendurable. Now, with far better preparation and the finest ships the Royal Navy could provide, he seemed destined for triumph. The provisions being loaded were extraordinary in their scope and variety. Thousands of tins of preserved meat, vegetables, and soup lined the holds. Barrels of flour, salt, pork, and other staples were stacked carefully. Coal for the steam engines filled designated compartments. Scientific instruments, navigation equipment, and tools for collecting specimens were secured in special storage areas. The ships even carried a library of books, musical instruments, and writing materials to occupy the men during long Arctic nights. Every detail suggested meticulous planning, every conceivable need anticipated. HMS Erebus, the flagship, was a bomb vessel originally built for naval warfare, but converted for polar exploration. Her hull had been reinforced with thick oak planking and iron plates to withstand the crushing pressure of pack ice. A steam engine had been installed, providing auxiliary power when sails could not be used. Heating systems ran through the ship, designed to keep the crew comfortable even in extreme cold. She was 105 feet long, displaced 370 tons, and represented the cutting edge of maritime technology. HMS Terror, her sister ship, boasted similar modifications. She too had been strengthened, equipped with a steam engine, and outfitted with every modern convenience. Her commander, Francis Crozier, was an experienced Arctic explorer, a veteran of multiple expeditions, including voyages with the famous explorer James Clark Ross. Crozier knew the Arctic intimately, understood its dangers, and brought a level of caution and experience that complemented Franklin's confidence. The officers were carefully chosen, men of education and capability. James Fitzjames, second in command on Erebus, was young and ambitious, known for his charm and intelligence. Commander Crozier, leading Terror, was older, more weathered, a man who understood that the Arctic gave no quarter to overconfidence. The Ice Masters, men specifically trained to navigate through polar ice, had been selected for their expertise. Surgeons, engineers, and scientists rounded out the command structure, creating what was arguably the best equipped and most capable Arctic expedition ever assembled. As the morning progressed, final farewells were exchanged. Franklin embraced his wife, Lady Jane Franklin, a woman who would later become instrumental in the search efforts that would consume decades. She had given him a silk Union Jack to plant at the successful completion of the Northwest Passage, a symbol of British triumph that she hoped would fly over a conquered Arctic. Their parting was tender but brief, both understanding that duty called and that 3 years would pass before they met again. The crowds cheered as lines were cast off. Sails were raised, catching the spring breeze. The steam engines coughed to life, their paddle wheels beginning to churn the water. Slowly, majestically, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror moved away from the dock, beginning their journey down the Thames toward the open sea. Handkerchiefs waved frantically, hats were thrown into the air. The sound of hurrahs echoed across the water, a roar of support and confidence that followed the ships as they turned downriver. Those watching from shore saw a sight that filled them with pride. 2 powerful vessels, loaded with the finest provisions, manned by capable sailors, commanded by experienced officers, departing on a mission to achieve what had eluded explorers for centuries. The Northwest Passage, that legendary route through the Arctic, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, seemed finally within reach. Britain, at the height of its imperial power, was sending forth its best to claim this prize. Franklin stood at the stern of Erebus, watching London recede into the distance. The city's spires and rooftops gradually shrank, becoming indistinct shapes along the horizon. The river widened, becoming the estuary, then opening into the North Sea. The voyage had begun, not just a physical journey into the Arctic, but a journey that would become one of history's most profound mysteries, a story that would haunt generations and remain incompletely solved even into the modern era. The Northwest Passage had tantalized explorers for more than 300 years. The concept was simple in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in practice. To find a navigable water route through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Such a route would revolutionize trade, cutting thousands of miles from the journey between Europe and Asia, eliminating the need to sail around Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope. Previous expeditions had probed the edges of this Arctic maze, charting coastlines, mapping islands, and pushing ever deeper into the frozen channels. Some had achieved remarkable feats of exploration and endurance. Others had ended in disaster, with ships crushed by ice and crews lost to cold, starvation, and disease. The Arctic was known to be treacherous, its ice fields unpredictable, its weather brutal, its isolation complete. Yet the potential rewards, geographic knowledge, national prestige, commercial advantage, continued to draw explorers northward. Franklin's expedition was tasked with completing what others had started. The Admiralty's instructions were clear. Sail to Lancaster Sound, the known entry point into the Arctic archipelago. From there, proceed westward and southward, navigating through the channels and passages until reaching the Pacific Ocean. Along the way, conduct scientific observations, collect specimens, and map any unknown territories. The expedition was expected to take between 2 and 3 years, with provisions loaded accordingly. The timing seemed propitious. Recent expeditions had made significant progress in charting the Arctic. James Clark Ross had explored the region just a few years earlier, identifying potential routes. The gaps in geographical knowledge were narrowing. With Franklin's experience, the advanced capabilities of Erebus and Terror, and 3 years of supplies, success seemed not just possible but probable. The crew had been recruited carefully. The 129 men represented a cross-section of naval expertise. There were experienced Arctic sailors who had survived previous polar voyages. There were young officers eager to make their reputations. There were skilled tradesmen, carpenters, sailmakers, blacksmiths, whose abilities would be essential for maintaining and repairing the ships in remote conditions. There were scientists interested in magnetic observations, natural history, and geographic discovery. And there were ordinary seamen, the backbone of any naval vessel, men who would handle the demanding physical labor of sailing through ice-choked waters. The provisions reflected both the expedition's expected duration and Victorian Britain's industrial capabilities. The introduction of tinned food preservation was relatively recent, and the Franklin expedition carried an enormous quantity of preserved provisions sealed in tin cans. Thousands upon thousands of tins were loaded into the holds, containing meat, vegetables, soups, and other foods thought to remain edible for years. This technology was supposed to free the expedition from complete dependence on hunting and foraging, allowing them to focus on navigation and exploration. In addition to food, the ships carried coal for the steam engines, a technological advantage that previous sailing expeditions had lacked. The engines could provide power when wind failed or when maneuvering through tight ice channels. They could also power the heating systems that would keep the crews warm during Arctic winters. The combination of sail and steam represented the height of maritime capability, a marriage of traditional seamanship and modern engineering. The scientific mission was also significant. The expedition carried instruments for magnetic observations, part of a broader effort to understand the Earth's magnetic field. They would take depth soundings, collect rock and fossil samples, observe weather patterns, and document any wildlife encountered. Natural history specimens would be preserved and brought back to London for study. The expedition was not merely a race to complete the Northwest Passage, but a comprehensive scientific endeavor. Franklin's personal qualities seemed well suited to the mission. Though 59 was considered old for such a demanding expedition, his experience was invaluable. He had served in the Royal Navy since he was a boy, participating in the Battle of Trafalgar and exploring Australia before turning his attention to the Arctic. His previous expeditions had taught him about polar conditions, about the importance of discipline and morale, about the ways that cold and darkness could affect men. He was also known for his kindness and fairness, qualities that would be essential for maintaining harmony during long months of confinement. The broader context of the expedition reflected British imperial ambitions. This was an age when Britain sought to expand its geographical knowledge, to plant its flag in unexplored regions, to demonstrate its naval supremacy. The Northwest Passage represented one of the last great geographic challenges, a blank space on the map waiting to be filled in with British discoveries. Success would bring glory not just to Franklin and his men, but to the nation itself. As Erebus and Terror sailed northward from England, passing through familiar waters toward the unknown Arctic, the crew settled into shipboard routines. Watches were established, dividing the men into shifts that would maintain the ships around the clock. Meals were served at regular intervals. Officers conducted drills to keep the crews sharp. The ships moved steadily, covering miles each day, their wakes stretching behind them like paths leading back to civilization. The mood aboard was optimistic. The weather was fair, the ships performed admirably, and the men were in good health and spirits. Franklin wrote letters to be sent back from the last port of call before entering the Arctic proper, expressing confidence and satisfaction with the expedition's progress. Other officers did likewise, penning reassurances to families and sharing observations about the voyage. These letters, cheerful and hopeful, would later be read with heartbreaking poignancy by those who waited in vain for the expedition's return. Last contact with civilization. In late July 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror reached Baffin Bay, the gateway to the Canadian Arctic. Here, in these waters where whalers pursued their dangerous trade, the expedition had its last confirmed contact with the outside world. 2 whaling vessels encountered Franklin's ships moored to an iceberg, waiting for favorable conditions to proceed into Lancaster Sound. The whalers pulled alongside, their captains exchanging pleasantries with Franklin and his officers. The conversation was routine, the sort of interaction common in these remote waters. Franklin reported that all was well, that the ships and crews were in excellent condition, that they had encountered no significant difficulties. The provisions were holding up perfectly. The steam engines were performing as expected. Morale was high. There was no indication of concern or trouble, only confidence and determination. Captain Dannett, of the whaler Prince of Wales, later recalled Franklin appearing in good spirits, perhaps even jovial. The older explorer seemed pleased with the expedition's progress and optimistic about the prospects ahead. Officers from both Erebus and Terror were visible on deck, attending to their duties with the efficiency expected of Royal Navy men. The crew appeared healthy and well organized, their ships trim and ready for the challenges of Arctic navigation. Some of the whalers offered advice about ice conditions they had observed, sharing knowledge gained from years of experience in these waters. Franklin listened politely, though he and his officers had studied Arctic navigation extensively and felt well prepared. The conversation was brief, a pleasant interlude in the isolation of the far north. Then, with farewells exchanged and good wishes offered, the ships parted ways. The whalers continued their hunt, and Franklin's expedition turned westward into Lancaster Sound. This encounter, unremarkable at the time, would become one of the most significant moments in the entire Franklin story. It was the last time anyone from outside the expedition saw these men alive. The whaling captains could not have known that the cheerful officers and healthy sailors they glimpsed would, within a few years, all perish in one of history's most complete disasters. The date was late July, 1845, and from that moment, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed into legend. Lancaster Sound is a wide channel, a natural corridor leading westward into the Arctic archipelago. When conditions are favorable, it offers relatively clear passage. Its waters deep enough for large vessels, its ice sometimes broken up by currents and winds. Franklin steered his ships into this gateway, following the Admiralty's instructions, beginning the true Arctic portion of the voyage. The initial progress must have been encouraging. The ships would have made steady headway, their steam engines supplementing sail power when needed. The crew would have watched the ice with professional interest, noting its thickness and movement, calculating routes through clear channels. The midnight sun would have provided constant daylight, eliminating the distinction between day and night, allowing work to continue around the clock. But the Arctic is a realm of deception. Conditions that seem favorable can change with frightening speed. Ice that appears navigable can close into impenetrable barriers within hours. Channels that look promising can dead-end in frozen masses. The very landscape shifts constantly. Ice flows rotating and drifting, leads opening and closing, the frozen sea never truly still. Franklin proceeded with caution, but also with confidence. His orders were to sail west and south, seeking a passage through to the Pacific. The maps of the region were incomplete, showing some coastlines and islands, but leaving vast areas blank. This was both the challenge and the opportunity to fill in those blanks, to discover the route that would finally connect the Atlantic and Pacific through Arctic waters. The expedition likely spent weeks probing the channels, testing different routes, taking soundings, and making observations. Officers would have consulted charts, compared their positions with previous expeditions' findings, and debated the best course forward. The ice masters would have climbed to the crow's nests, scanning the horizon for signs of open water or threatening ice formations. The engineers would have monitored the steam engines, ensuring they were ready for demanding maneuvers. As summer progressed, the expedition must have made significant progress westward. They would have sailed past Devon Island and Cornwallis Island, landmarks charted by earlier explorers. They may have encountered ice that required careful navigation, but nothing they couldn't handle. The constant daylight would have aided their work, and the relative warmth of Arctic summer, though still cold by most standards, would have kept conditions manageable. At some point, likely in September as autumn arrived, Franklin faced a crucial decision. The channels ahead branched in multiple directions. Some appeared to lead southwest toward the known coastline of North America. Others curved northwest, potentially offering routes, but also potentially leading into dead ends. Winter was approaching rapidly. Soon the ice would consolidate, trapping any ship that had not found safe harbor or open water. The expedition needed to choose its route carefully. Based on evidence discovered many years later, Franklin chose to proceed southward down Peel Sound, aiming for a channel between Prince of Wales Island and Somerset Island. This route would take the expedition deeper into the archipelago, closer to the theoretical position of the Northwest Passage. It was a reasonable choice based on the available geographical knowledge, but it would prove catastrophic. As September gave way to October, the ice began to close in. The temperature dropped steadily. The midnight sun disappeared, replaced first by shortened days and then by the approach of polar night. The water between ice flows, which had allowed passage just weeks earlier, began to freeze solid. The ship's progress slowed, then stopped entirely as ice gripped their hulls. This was not unexpected. Arctic expeditions anticipated spending at least one winter frozen in, waiting for the following summer's thaw to free their vessels. Franklin and his officers would have begun preparations for overwintering, securing the ships, setting up routines for the long darkness, and rationing provisions to ensure they would last through the months ahead. But the ice that gripped Erebus and Terror in the autumn of 1845 would never release them. The ships had sailed into a trap, a region where ice conditions were particularly severe, where the normal summer thaw would prove insufficient to free vessels locked in. Franklin could not have known this. The variability of Arctic ice was not well understood, and what might be navigable one year could be impassable the next. So, the expedition settled in for winter, confident that spring would bring release and allow them to complete their mission. Officers organized activities to keep the men occupied: classes, theatrical performances, scientific observations. Supplies were inventoried and rationed. The heating systems kept the ships tolerable, if not comfortable. Outside, darkness descended, the polar night that would last for months, a period when the sun would not rise above the horizon, when temperatures would plunge to extremes, when the ice would tighten its grip like a slowly closing fist. The ice trap. The first winter passed, as winters do in the Arctic, slowly and with considerable hardship but manageable for a well-prepared expedition. The crew of 129 men maintained their routines, kept their spirits up as best they could, and waited for the sun's return. Officers continued making scientific observations, recording temperature, magnetic readings, and astronomical positions. The ships, though trapped in ice, remained secure, their reinforced hulls holding against the pressure of the frozen sea. When spring arrived in 1846, bringing the return of daylight and rising temperatures, the expedition must have watched anxiously for signs of breakup. They needed the ice to fracture, to create channels of open water that would allow them to sail free. They must have climbed to high points on the ice, scanning the horizon for leads, for any indication that the frozen sea was releasing its grip. But the ice that held Erebus in terror was particularly tenacious. The region where they were trapped, near King William Island in an area that would later be identified as the Victoria Strait, suffered from some of the worst ice conditions in the entire Arctic archipelago. Ocean currents carried ice into this region from further north, creating multi-year ice that was thicker and more resistant to melting than the annual ice found in other channels. As the brief Arctic summer of 1846 progressed, the ice around the ships likely shifted and groaned, creating pressure ridges and occasional cracks, but it did not break up enough to free the vessels. The expedition remained trapped, now for more than a year. Provisions were being consumed steadily. The supplies that had seemed so abundant when loaded in London were slowly diminishing. Franklin and his officers must have begun to feel the first stirrings of concern, though they were still far from desperate. They had planned for 3 years, and only one had passed. The second winter approached, bringing with it the return of darkness and extreme cold. The crew again settled into winter routines, but the mood would have been more subdued than the previous year. The novelty had worn off, the isolation was becoming oppressive, and the nagging worry about whether they would escape the ice the following summer would have weighed on everyone's mind. It was during this second winter, specifically in June 1847, that Sir John Franklin died. The circumstances of his death remain unknown. The note later discovered by searchers stated simply that he died on June 11, 1847, but gave no cause. He was 61 years old and had been enduring the extreme conditions of the Arctic for nearly 2 years. It's possible he suffered a heart attack or stroke. He may have succumbed to disease. The lead poisoning that was slowly affecting the entire crew may have contributed. Whatever the cause, the expedition lost its commander, the man whose experience and leadership were supposed to guide them through this challenge. Command passed to Francis Crozier, the captain of HMS Terror. Crozier was in many ways better suited to the desperate situation than Franklin had been. He was younger, tougher, more familiar with the harsh realities of Arctic survival. He had experience with previous expeditions that had faced similar difficulties. If anyone could lead the crew to safety, it was Crozier. But Crozier inherited an increasingly dire situation. By the spring of 1847, the expedition had been trapped for nearly 2 years. Provisions were running low. The tinned food, upon which they depended, was beginning to show problems. Some tins were spoiling, their contents rotten and inedible. Others, though still edible, were slowly poisoning the crew with lead that leached from the solder used to seal the cans. The men were developing scurvy from lack of fresh food, their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, their bodies weakening. When summer came in 1847, Crozier must have hoped desperately for the ice to break up. The crew needed to escape, needed to reach open water and sail to safety. But once again, the ice refused to cooperate. The ships remained locked in place, immovable despite any efforts to free them. The brief summer ended, and a third winter descended upon the expedition. This third winter, from the autumn of 1847 through the spring of 1848, must have been a time of growing desperation. The crew had now endured nearly 3 years in the ice. The ships, though still intact, were slowly deteriorating. The heating systems consumed coal that was in limited supply. Food continued to dwindle, and the men themselves were succumbing to malnutrition, disease, and the psychological toll of prolonged isolation and hardship. By April 1848, the situation had become untenable. The expedition had consumed most of its provisions. The ships showed no sign of escaping the ice anytime soon. Men were dying regularly from scurvy, lead poisoning, and other ailments. Crozier faced an impossible choice. They could remain with the ships, hoping for a rescue that showed no sign of coming, slowly starving and freezing. Or they could abandon the vessels and attempt to walk out, dragging supplies and boats across the ice toward distant outposts of civilization. Crozier chose to abandon ship. On the 22nd of April 1848, the survivors, now numbering 105 after deaths from disease and cold, left HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They took what supplies they could carry, loaded boats onto sledges, and began the long march southward. The plan was to reach the Canadian mainland, then follow the coast eastward to known trading posts where help might be found. It was a desperate gamble, but staying with the ships meant certain death. The note left behind in a cairn, later discovered by search parties, recorded these facts in terse, official language. HMS Erebus and Terror had been trapped in ice since the 12th of September, 1846. Franklin had died on the 11th of June, 1847. Total deaths to that point were 9 officers and 15 men. The survivors under Crozier's command were abandoning the ships and heading for the back river. The message was dated the 25th of April, 1848, just 3 days after the abandonment began. What the note did not say, what could not be expressed in official naval language, was the desperation of the situation. These 105 men were setting out on a journey of hundreds of miles across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. They were already weakened by years of poor nutrition and disease. They were hauling boats and supplies that weighed hundreds of pounds. They had limited knowledge of the region they were traversing, and they were facing the Arctic's brutal reality that it shows no mercy to the unprepared or the unlucky. The ships sat abandoned in the ice, Erebus and Terror, empty and silent, their decks no longer bustling with activity, their holds no longer filled with provisions, their crews gone forever. The ice would hold these vessels for years, slowly crushing and damaging them, eventually releasing them to sink to the seafloor, where they would rest undiscovered for more than 160 years. But in April 1848, they were simply abandoned, left behind by men who had no other choice, monuments to an expedition that had gone terribly catastrophically wrong. The Death March. The 105 men who set out from the ships in late April 1848 began one of history's most tragic marches. They were organized into parties, each responsible for hauling a boat mounted on a sledge. These boats, heavy wooden vessels designed for use in water, were extraordinarily difficult to drag across rough ice and frozen ground. But they were essential, as the men hoped to eventually reach water where the boats could be launched, allowing faster travel. The sledges were loaded with provisions, tools, weapons, and personal items. In their determination to survive, or perhaps in a state of confusion brought on by lead poisoning and starvation, the men loaded items of questionable utility. Search parties later found sledges containing silverware, books, button polish, and other goods that served no practical survival purpose, but added weight to the already crushing burden of hauling the boats. The route chosen by Crozier led southward and westward, aiming for the mainland coast and then eastward toward the Back River and eventually toward Hudson Bay, where trading posts existed. It was the logical choice given their position, but it meant traversing hundreds of miles of terrain that offered almost nothing in the way of food or shelter. The Arctic in spring is marginally less hostile than in winter, but it remains a brutal environment, cold, windy, and utterly barren. The men's physical condition was already compromised when they began. Years of inadequate nutrition had left them weak. Scurvy had rotted their gums and loosened their teeth, making eating painful and reducing their ability to absorb nutrients. Lead poisoning affected their judgment and weakened their bodies further. Some were likely suffering from tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other diseases that flourished in the close quarters and poor conditions aboard the ice-locked ships. As they hauled the boats southward, the physical exertion in their weakened state would have accelerated their decline. The work of pulling hundreds of pounds across ice and snow burns enormous amounts of calories. Calories they did not have to spare. Each day of travel made them weaker, less able to continue, closer to collapse, and the cold, though less extreme than in winter, still sapped their strength and made every action more difficult. The expedition left a trail across the ice and land, a path marked by abandoned equipment, dead bodies, and makeshift camps. As men died, they were left where they fell, the survivors lacking the strength to bury them and needing every ounce of energy to continue moving. The corpses, frozen by the Arctic cold, would remain preserved for more than a century, silent witnesses to the catastrophe unfolding. Inuit people living in the region encountered evidence of the expedition's passage. They found campsites with scattered remains, abandoned supplies, and bodies. Some Inuit later testified to seeing groups of white men, their faces blackened by scurvy and frostbite, struggling southward, too weak to hunt effectively or build proper shelters. The Inuit were skilled Arctic survivors, knowing how to hunt seals, build snow houses, and navigate the frozen landscape. They could have helped, could have shared survival knowledge, but language barriers and cultural differences prevented effective communication. The British sailors, trained in naval traditions and unfamiliar with Inuit ways, may have been too proud or too confused to accept help, even if it was offered. As the march continued, the parties began to fragment. Some men were too weak to keep up and were left behind. Others may have wandered off, delirious from starvation or lead poisoning. The organized structure of the expedition broke down as survival became increasingly individual rather than collective. The bonds of discipline and naval tradition that had held the men together for years frayed under the strain of extremity. The boats, so carefully hauled across the ice, proved difficult to use when water was finally reached. The men were too weak to launch them effectively, and the currents and ice made navigation treacherous. Some boats were abandoned, left sitting on beaches or shores, their crews dead nearby. The vision of sailing to safety remained perpetually just out of reach, a hope that faded as strength failed. Food became the overwhelming obsession. The provisions brought from the ships ran out quickly, consumed at an unsustainable rate by men burning massive calories in their exertion. Attempts at hunting were largely unsuccessful. The men lacked the skills and knowledge to effectively hunt Arctic game, and their weakness made stalking and killing animals nearly impossible. They tried to fish, but with limited success. The Arctic offered almost no plant foods, no berries or roots that could supplement their diet. Starvation tightened its grip with each passing day. Evidence suggests that in the final stages, when hope was gone and death was certain, some men resorted to cannibalism. Bones found by later search parties showed cut marks consistent with defleshing, marks made by metal tools used to remove meat from human remains. This discovery, when it emerged, shocked Victorian Britain, a society that recoiled from such practices. But for men at the absolute extremity of starvation, the taboo against eating the dead may have seemed less important than the instinct to survive a few more days. Even this desperate measure could not save them. The bodies of their dead companions offered only a temporary reprieve, a few more days of life in a situation where survival had already become impossible. One by one, the men succumbed. They died of starvation, of scurvy, of hypothermia, of diseases that ravaged their weakened bodies. They died alone or in small groups, separated from their companions by the vast Arctic landscape. They died far from home, in a frozen wilderness that would hide their remains for decades. The last survivors, whoever they were, died knowing that their expedition had failed completely. They had not completed the Northwest Passage. They had not returned to share their discoveries. They had not survived to see England again. The Arctic, which had seemed a challenge to be conquered with British determination and industrial technology, had proven utterly merciless, destroying the expedition so thoroughly that not a single man lived to tell the tale directly. By the summer of 1848, less than 4 months after abandoning the ships, all 105 men who had set out on the death march were dead. Their bodies lay scattered across King William Island and the nearby mainland coast, some alone, some in small groups, all frozen and preserved by the Arctic cold. The Franklin expedition, which had departed London with such hope and confidence just 3 years earlier, had been annihilated, every single man lost to one of history's most complete maritime disasters. The growing silence. Back in England, the families of Franklin's crew waited with increasing anxiety. The first year brought no news, but this was expected. Arctic expeditions could not easily communicate with the outside world, and mail took months to travel, even when routes existed. The second year also passed without word, and while this was concerning, it was not yet alarming. 3-year expeditions were standard, and communication was simply not possible from the Arctic. But as 1,848 turned to 1,849, and still no word came, worry turned to genuine fear. The expedition should have emerged by now. If they had successfully navigated the Northwest Passage, they would have reached the Pacific and sent word back through Russian or American channels. If they had turned back, they should have returned to Baffin Bay, where whalers could have carried news to London. The absolute silence suggested something was very wrong. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's widow, began pushing the Admiralty to launch search efforts. She was a formidable woman, determined and resourceful, who would dedicate the rest of her life to discovering her husband's fate. Initially, the Admiralty resisted, arguing that it was too soon for concern, that the expedition might yet emerge safe. But Lady Franklin's persistence, combined with growing public pressure, eventually forced action. In 1848, the first search expeditions were organized. These were modest efforts, ships sent to probe the areas where Franklin was thought to have traveled, seeking any sign of the missing expedition. The searchers found nothing. The Arctic, vast and unforgiving, revealed no clues. It was as if Erebus and Terror had simply vanished, swallowed by the ice without a trace. More search expeditions followed in 1849, 1850, and subsequent years. The effort grew into one of the largest search operations in history, with both the Royal Navy and private expeditions funded by Lady Franklin and other concerned parties scouring the Arctic. Ships approached from multiple directions, some sailing from the east through Lancaster Sound, others from the west via the Bering Strait, still others attempting routes from the south through Hudson Bay. The searchers faced the same challenges that had doomed Franklin: ice-trapped vessels, forcing them to overwinter in conditions nearly as harsh as those Franklin had endured. Crews suffered from scurvy and cold. Some search expeditions themselves required rescue. The Arctic proved as difficult for those seeking Franklin as it had been for Franklin himself, a frozen labyrinth that gave up its secrets grudgingly, if at all. In 1850, the first significant discoveries were made. Search parties found signs of Franklin's first winter camp on Beechey Island, a small outcrop in the Arctic archipelago. Here, clearly visible, were 3 graves, marked with wooden headboards carved with names and dates. John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain had all died in early 1846, during or shortly after the expedition's first winter. They had been buried carefully, their graves arranged in a neat row, a final act of respect from their shipmates. The discovery of these graves proved that Franklin had at least reached this point, but it offered little information about what had happened afterward. The graves showed that men had died early in the voyage, but 3 deaths in an expedition of 129 was not unusual or particularly alarming. There was no indication of disaster, no clues about where the expedition had gone after leaving Beechey Island. Searchers scoured the island, finding scattered artifacts, scraps of cloth, food tins, pieces of equipment. They found rock cairns that had been built, presumably to mark the expedition's presence, but the cairns contained no messages, no notes explaining the expedition's plans or situation. Franklin had passed through this location, wintered here, lost 3 men, and then sailed on into the unknown. The search continued year after year, expanding to cover more of the Arctic. Explorers charted coastlines and islands that had never been mapped before, filling in the blank spaces that had existed when Franklin set out. In a tragic irony, the search for Franklin accomplished much of what his expedition had intended: the mapping and exploration of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. But the man himself remained missing, his fate a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. In 1854, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. John Rae, a Scottish explorer working for the Hudson's Bay Company, was conducting surveys along the Arctic coast when he encountered Inuit people who had a remarkable story to tell. They spoke of finding bodies of white men, dozens of them, scattered along the coast of King William Island and the mainland. They described discovering abandoned boats, supplies, and other evidence of a disaster. Most significantly, the Inuit possessed artifacts that had clearly come from Franklin's expedition. They had silverware engraved with officers' initials, medals, buttons, and other items that could only have originated from Erebus and Terror. When asked how they had obtained these items, the Inuit explained they had found them among the dead and at abandoned campsites. Some items had been acquired through trade with other Inuit groups who lived further north. Rae gathered as much information as he could, purchasing artifacts to bring back as evidence and recording the Inuit testimonies in detail. The stories painted a grim picture. The Inuit spoke of men who were starving, who were too weak to hunt effectively, who were dying in large numbers. Some accounts suggested that the last survivors had resorted to eating their dead companions, a detail that Ray included in his report but which would cause a firestorm of controversy when it reached England. When Ray returned to London and delivered his report, the reaction was mixed. The artifacts he brought back proved conclusively that he had information about Franklin's fate, but the suggestion of cannibalism horrified Victorian society, particularly Lady Franklin and her supporters, who denounced Ray and insisted that British naval officers would never descend to such practices. The controversy overshadowed the valuable information Ray had gathered, delaying full acceptance of his findings. Despite the resistance, Ray's report provided crucial clues about where to search. Subsequent expeditions focused on King William Island and the nearby mainland coast, the areas where the Inuit had found evidence of the disaster. In 1859, another major discovery was made when a search party found a cairn containing a note left by Franklin's crew. The note, actually two messages written on the same Admiralty form at different times, told the expedition's story in stark, official language. The first message, dated the 28th of May 1847, was routine, reporting that the ships had wintered at Beechey Island and then sailed around Cornwallis Island before becoming trapped in ice off King William Island. At that point, all was still well, and there was no hint of coming disaster. But the margins of the same paper contained a second message, added nearly a year later in April 1848. This message was devastating. It reported that the ships had been trapped in ice since the 12th of September, 1846, that Franklin had died on the 11th of June, 1847, and that total deaths numbered 24. The surviving 105 men under the command of Captain Crozier were abandoning the ships and attempting to march to safety via the Back River. The message was signed by Crozier and James Fitzjames, the second in command. This note provided the framework for understanding the disaster. Franklin's expedition had not been destroyed by a single catastrophic event but had been ground down slowly over nearly 3 years. Trapped in ice that never released them, consuming supplies that proved inadequate and contaminated, dying gradually from disease and starvation, the crew had finally been forced to abandon ship and attempt an escape that had clearly failed. Evidence of desperation. As more search parties combed King William Island in the years following Ray's report, a grim picture emerged. The island was dotted with relics from Franklin's death march, a trail of desperation stretching southward from where the ships had been abandoned. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, revealing the expedition's final days in heartbreaking detail. Boats were found, left sitting on shore, or partially buried in snow. These were large, heavy naval boats, designed to be rowed or sailed, but extraordinarily difficult to drag across ice and land. Some still contained the bodies of crew members who had died while resting inside. The boats were often loaded with strange assortments of items, practical survival gear, mixed with completely useless luxuries. One boat, discovered by searchers, contained an astonishing array of goods. Along with useful items like chocolate and tea, there were books, button polish, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, and silverware. The boat also contained 2 bodies, skeletons dressed in the remains of naval uniforms, surrounded by these odd possessions. The scene suggested men whose judgment had been severely impaired, perhaps by lead poisoning or starvation-induced delirium, clinging to items from their old lives even as they struggled to survive. Scattered equipment told its own story. Searchers found tools, navigation instruments, weapons, and clothing strewn along the route the expedition had taken. Some items had been carefully cached, placed under rocks or in built cairns, suggesting the men had hoped to retrieve them later. Other items appeared to have been simply dropped or abandoned as the carriers became too weak to continue. The human remains were the most disturbing evidence. Skeletons lay scattered across the island, some alone, some in small groups. Many showed signs of scurvy, with long bones that had become porous and fragile. Some bones bore cut marks, incisions made by metal tools in patterns consistent with defleshing, supporting the Inuit accounts of cannibalism. The discovery of these marks would continue to generate controversy for decades, with some historians defending the crew's honor and others accepting the physical evidence of what starvation can drive people to do. The bodies told stories of suffering. One skeleton was found still partially clothed in the remnants of a naval uniform, the fabric preserved by the Arctic cold. The man had been young, probably in his 20s, and had died alone on a wind-swept ridge overlooking the coast. Another skeleton was found in a boat, positioned as if the man had simply laid down to rest and never risen again. The Arctic had freeze-dried the remains, creating mummies that preserved facial features and expressions frozen at the moment of death. Some remains showed evidence of attempted burial. Fellow crew members, while they still had strength, had placed rocks over bodies or positioned them in sheltered locations. But many bodies had simply been left where they fell, the survivors too weak to perform even basic funeral rites. The Arctic wind had scattered bones, carrying lighter elements away and leaving heavier skulls and leg bones in place, creating eerie tableaus of death. The geographic distribution of remains suggested the expedition had fragmented as it progressed. There was a concentration of evidence near where the ships had been abandoned, another cluster along the western coast of King William Island, and scattered finds extending south to the mainland and beyond. This pattern indicated that some men had stayed near the ships longer, while others pushed ahead, that the cohesion of the group had broken down as circumstances became desperate. Artifacts found with the bodies revealed individual stories. One skeleton was found with a pocket knife and a metal tobacco case, personal items the man had kept with him until death. Another was discovered with a small leather pouch containing buttons and sewing supplies, perhaps a ship's steward or an officer's servant. These small personal objects humanized the disaster, reminding searchers that each skeleton represented a real person with a history, a family, and dreams that had died in the ice. The condition of the remains also provided clues about the timeline of death. Bodies found near the ships showed less extreme deterioration, suggesting these men had died earlier when conditions were slightly better. Bodies found further along the route showed more severe signs of starvation and disease, indicating prolonged suffering before death. The southernmost remains, found on the mainland coast, were in the worst condition, the final victims of a march that had consumed every man who attempted it. Search parties also found campsites where groups had stopped temporarily. These sites contained fire rings, suggesting the men had still been able to make fires for warmth and cooking. There were scattered bones from seals or other animals, indicating some hunting success, though not nearly enough to sustain them. There were also scraps of clothing, suggesting the men had torn up garments for fuel or other purposes when more conventional materials ran out. One particularly poignant discovery was a pile of books left at a campsite. These were volumes from the ship's library, brought along perhaps for comfort or distraction during rest stops. The titles ranged from novels to religious texts to practical manuals. That the men had carried these books so far, burdening themselves with the extra weight, spoke to their desperate need for something, anything, to remind them of civilization and normality. The physical landscape itself bore scars from the expedition's passage. Searchers found paths worn into the ground where boats had been dragged repeatedly. They found stone cairns, some marking camps, and others apparently built simply as messages or waypoints for those following behind. They found discarded sleds, broken equipment, and other evidence of an increasingly chaotic retreat from the ice-locked ships. Interestingly, some of the equipment found was in good condition, well maintained even under terrible circumstances. Navigation instruments were still in their cases, tools were clean and oiled, weapons were properly stored. This suggested that even as conditions deteriorated, some men had maintained naval standards and discipline, caring for their equipment with professional pride even when death was imminent. It was a final, futile gesture of order in the face of overwhelming chaos. The Inuit testimonies. The Inuit people who lived in the region had witnessed parts of the Franklin disaster, though they had not understood what they were seeing at the time. Their oral histories, gathered by various explorers and researchers over many decades, provided crucial information about the expedition's final days, information that could not be gleaned from the physical evidence alone. Inuit hunters and travelers reported seeing groups of white men during the late 1840s, around the time the expedition would have been abandoning the ships and attempting to march south. These accounts described men who were clearly in desperate condition, their faces darkened by scurvy and frostbite, their movements slow and labored, their appearance frightening to Inuit, who were not accustomed to seeing Europeans in such remote regions. One account described a group of approximately 40 men pulling a boat on a sled. Struggling across the ice toward the mainland, the Inuit observer noted that the men appeared very thin, that they were working with obvious difficulty, and that they seemed unaware of or uninterested in Inuit presence. When the observer tried to approach and offer help or trade, the white men waved him away, perhaps out of fear or pride, or simply because they were too exhausted to engage. Another testimony came from an Inuit woman who reported seeing a group of white men building something on the shore, possibly a shelter or boat repair station. She described them as appearing sick, moving slowly, and speaking in a language she could not understand. When she approached, one man tried to communicate through gestures, pointing south and then to his mouth, apparently trying to explain they were heading toward food or help. The woman offered fish, which the men accepted gratefully, but the language barrier prevented any deeper communication. Some Inuit discovered campsites and remains months or years after the men had died. They described finding tents still standing, bodies frozen inside, and supplies scattered around. In Inuit tradition, the dead and their possessions were to be respected, but the items left by Franklin's crew were extraordinary: metal tools, fabric, and other materials that were valuable and rare in the Arctic. Over time, many artifacts were salvaged and incorporated into Inuit life, distributed through trade networks across the region. The Inuit also reported finding one of the ships, though which ship and exactly when remained unclear from the oral accounts. They described a large wooden vessel trapped in ice, deserted and eerily quiet. Some Inuit went aboard and explored, finding it full of interesting items but also disturbing. The ship still set up as if people were living there, but completely abandoned. The ship eventually sank or was crushed by ice, its location lost until modern searchers rediscovered the wrecks. Perhaps the most significant Inuit contribution was their knowledge of where remains could be found. When European search parties arrived, Inuit guides led them to many of the locations where bodies, boats, and artifacts lay. Without this assistance, many discoveries would have taken far longer or might never have been made at all. The Inuit understanding of the landscape and their awareness of unusual features, a boat where no boat should be, bones that were not from animals, made them invaluable partners in the search. However, Inuit testimony was not always believed or properly valued by Victorian explorers. The cultural gap was enormous. Inuit lived in an oral tradition, passing information through stories rather than written records. European explorers, accustomed to written documentation and formal reports, sometimes dismissed Inuit accounts as unreliable or exaggerated. The language barrier also created misunderstandings, with details lost or confused in translation. The controversy over cannibalism particularly highlighted this cultural divide. When Inuit testified that they had found evidence of Europeans eating each other, the British establishment reacted with horror and denial. Many refused to believe that British naval officers could descend to such practices, preferring to think the Inuit were lying or mistaken. It would take physical evidence, the cut marks on bones, to finally force acceptance of this uncomfortable truth. Over time, as more Inuit accounts were gathered and compared with physical evidence, patterns emerged. The testimonies were remarkably consistent across different families and communities, describing the same general picture of starving, struggling men trying desperately to survive in an environment they did not understand. The details varied, as would be expected from independent observers, but the core story remained constant. Modern researchers have come to deeply value Inuit oral history. These accounts preserved information that would otherwise have been lost entirely, filling gaps that physical evidence alone could never address. The Inuit witnessed the human dimension of the disaster, saw the men as suffering individuals rather than just statistics or bones, and their testimonies remain crucial to understanding what happened during the Franklin expedition's final days. Theories and speculations. As evidence accumulated over the decades following the expedition's disappearance, researchers developed various theories to explain exactly what went wrong. The broad outline was clear: ships trapped in ice, crew weakened by disease and starvation, desperate attempt to escape ending in total failure. But the specific causes and the decisions made remained subjects of debate and speculation. The lead poisoning theory emerged strongly in the 20th century after researchers were allowed to exhume and study the 3 bodies buried at Beechey Island. The preservation was remarkable, the permafrost having kept the bodies frozen and largely intact for more than 130 years. Medical examination revealed extraordinarily high levels of lead in the tissues, far beyond what would be considered normal or safe. The source of this lead contamination was traced to the tinned food that made up so much of the expedition's provisions. The tins were sealed with lead solder, and acidic foods like tomatoes or fruits could cause lead to leach into the contents. Over months and years of consuming such food, the crew would have ingested massive amounts of lead, causing both physical deterioration and neurological damage. Lead poisoning symptoms include fatigue, weakness, abdominal pain, and neurological effects like confusion, poor judgment, and irritability. These symptoms would have compounded the expedition's other problems, making men weaker than they already were from scurvy and cold, impairing their decision-making at crucial moments, and possibly explaining some of the odd choices made, like hauling useless items on the death march. However, lead poisoning alone could not account for the disaster. Other Arctic expeditions of the same era consumed similar tinned foods and suffered similar lead exposure without experiencing total catastrophe. The Franklin expedition's lead poisoning must be understood as one factor among many, contributing to the overall decline, but not solely responsible for the outcome. Scurvy was certainly another major killer. This vitamin C deficiency disease was the scourge of long sea voyages, causing gums to rot, teeth to fall out, wounds to fail healing, and eventually death. The expedition's provisions included some anti-scorbutics, foods thought to prevent scurvy, but clearly not enough or not effective enough. By the time the death march began, many men would have been severely affected, unable to heal from even minor injuries and susceptible to other diseases. The quality and quantity of provisions has also been questioned. The contract for supplying the tinned food went to the lowest bidder, a company that may have cut corners in preparation or preservation. Some evidence suggests the tins were poorly made, with shoddy soldering that allowed contents to spoil. The expedition's provisioning assumed they would supplement supplies with hunting, but Franklin's route through the ice offered few hunting opportunities, and the crew lacked the skills to effectively hunt Arctic game even when it was available. The route Franklin chose has been endlessly debated. He sailed south through Peel Sound, aiming for what appeared to be a direct route toward the Northwest Passage. But this route led into some of the worst ice conditions in the Arctic. The area where Erebus and Terror became trapped experiences multi-year ice that rarely breaks up completely. A different route, even one just a few miles to the east or west, might have encountered more favorable conditions. However, Franklin could not have known this. The mapping of Arctic ice conditions was in its infancy, and what might be navigable one year could be impassable the next. Franklin made a reasonable choice based on available information, and he was simply unlucky in encountering particularly bad ice. The element of chance, the unpredictable nature of Arctic conditions, played a major role in the disaster. The decision to abandon ship has also been questioned. Was it premature? Could the crew have survived longer aboard the vessels, waiting for a thaw or a rescue? Or was Crozier right that staying meant certain death and marching south at least offered a chance, however slim, of survival? The timeline suggests that by April 1848, conditions aboard the ships were untenable. Food was nearly gone, coal was depleted, and men were dying regularly. Staying might have prolonged life by weeks or a few months, but the outcome would likely have been the same. The direction of the march has also generated discussion. Crozier led his men south and east, aiming for the Back River and eventually Hudson Bay. But there were known outposts to the north and west, fur trading posts that might have offered rescue. Why didn't the expedition head in that direction? The answer probably lies in distance and knowledge. The northern outposts were far away, and the route would have required traveling through unknown territory. The southward route, while also deadly, at least followed the coastline and offered the theoretical possibility of encountering rescue parties or indigenous people who might help. Some have speculated about psychological factors. Did the crew panic? Did discipline break down? Were there mutinies or conflicts that hastened the disaster? The available evidence suggests that naval discipline largely held even under extreme conditions. Officers continued to make organized decisions, supplies were distributed fairly, and men followed orders. The expedition died in an orderly fashion, if such a thing is possible, not through chaos, but through the gradual erosion of strength and hope. The question of whether a rescue could have succeeded also haunts the story. If search parties had been launched earlier, if they had looked in the right places, could some of Franklin's crew have been saved? Probably not. The region was so remote, the conditions so harsh, and the time windows so narrow that even if rescuers had arrived at the trapped ships, extracting the crew would have been nearly impossible. And by the time serious search efforts began, all of Franklin's men were almost certainly already dead. The discovery of the wrecks. For more than 160 years, the wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror remained lost. Search efforts in the 19th century had located many artifacts and remains, but never found the ships themselves. The vessels were assumed to have sunk or been crushed by ice, their locations somewhere in the Arctic waters but impossibly difficult to pinpoint in the vast, ice-choked region. In the early 21st century, new technology and renewed interest brought fresh search efforts. Parks Canada, the Canadian government agency responsible for national historic sites, launched expeditions using modern sonar, underwater vehicles, and other advanced equipment. They focused on areas suggested by Inuit oral history, testimony that had been recorded but not always fully investigated. In September 2014, the search paid off. Sonar images revealed a large wreck sitting upright on the seabed in relatively shallow water south of King William Island. The location matched Inuit accounts of seeing a ship in the area years after Franklin's expedition had disappeared. Underwater vehicles sent down to investigate captured stunning images. It was HMS Erebus, remarkably intact, sitting proud on the bottom as if waiting to be found. The discovery was extraordinary. The ship's hull was largely preserved. Masts were missing, but the deck remained largely intact, and artifacts were scattered around the wreck site. Divers exploring the wreck found glass bottles, wooden barrels, metal tools, and other items in remarkable condition thanks to the cold Arctic water. The ship's bell was recovered, a powerful symbol and confirmation of identity. 2 years later, in September 2016, an even more remarkable discovery was made. HMS Terror was found, not near Erebus, but many miles to the north in Terror Bay, an area that bears the ship's name based on Inuit testimony of a ship's presence there. Terror was in even better condition than Erebus, sitting upright and nearly intact in deep, cold water that had preserved it magnificently. Underwater footage of Terror showed a ship that looked almost ready to sail. The deck was largely complete, hatches were closed, and the interior appeared accessible. Divers peering through windows could see inside the cabins, where furniture, dishes, and personal items remained in place, as if the crew had just stepped away. The preservation was so complete that some compared it to a time capsule, a window into the 1,840 seconds frozen in place. These discoveries reignited global interest in the Franklin expedition. They provided new opportunities for research, with artifacts recovered from the wrecks offering clues about daily life aboard, the crew's condition, and the decisions made during the final years. The wrecks also raised new questions. Why were the ships so far apart? Had they drifted after being abandoned, or had they been moved deliberately? The evidence continues to be analyzed and debated. The discovery also held deep significance for Canada's Indigenous peoples, particularly the Inuit, whose oral histories had pointed to these locations. For generations, their testimony had been dismissed or undervalued. The discovery of the wrecks, exactly where Inuit accounts suggested they would be, was powerful validation of traditional knowledge, demonstrating that oral history could be as accurate and valuable as written records. For the British, the discoveries were bittersweet. The ships represented a significant piece of maritime history, symbols of an era of exploration and ambition. But they were also graves, final resting places connected to a disaster that had claimed so many lives. The wrecks were treated with respect, carefully investigated but not ransacked, honored as the historical and cultural treasures they are. Future investigations of the wrecks may yield more information. Scientists hope to recover additional artifacts, to explore the ship's interiors more thoroughly, and perhaps to find documents, journals, or logs that could provide first-hand accounts of the expedition's final years. Such discoveries could answer lingering questions and provide closure to a mystery that has fascinated people for more than 170 years. But even as technology allows us to see the ships and recover their artifacts, some mysteries will likely never be fully solved. The day-to-day experiences of the crew, the conversations in the final months, the individual decisions and moments of courage or despair, these are lost to time. The Arctic keeps some secrets, even as it slowly reveals others. The meaning and memory. The Franklin expedition has become more than a historical event. It has entered the realm of legend and mythology, a story that resonates far beyond its factual details. The complete disappearance of 129 men, the decades of mystery before the truth emerged, and the tragic revelation of their fate have given the story a power that endures. In Victorian Britain, the disaster was a profound shock. The confident empire that had sent forth its finest men and best ships to conquer the Arctic had been humbled by nature's indifference. The revelation that the expedition had failed so completely, that every man had died, that some had resorted to cannibalism in their final desperation, challenged Victorian assumptions about British superiority and the triumph of civilization over wilderness. Yet the story also became one of heroism and endurance. Franklin and his men were remembered not as failures but as courageous explorers who had ventured into the unknown, who had maintained discipline and civilization under impossible conditions, and who had died in service to knowledge and empire. Monuments were erected, tributes were paid, and the Franklin expedition became part of British national mythology. For Canada, the Franklin story has particular significance. The expedition's fate unfolded entirely in what is now Canadian Arctic territory, making it part of Canadian history and heritage. The search for Franklin contributed to mapping and understanding the Canadian North. The modern discoveries of the wrecks have been celebrated as Canadian archaeological triumphs, symbols of the nation's Arctic sovereignty and scientific capability. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic, particularly the Inuit, have a complex relationship with the Franklin story. They were observers of the disaster, witnesses to the suffering of men who did not know how to survive in the Arctic. They provided crucial information to searchers, information that was often dismissed or undervalued. The modern validation of Inuit oral history through the discovery of the wrecks has been important for recognizing indigenous knowledge and giving proper credit to their contributions. The story has inspired countless books, articles, documentaries, songs, and works of art. Each generation reinterprets Franklin through its own lens. Victorian writers emphasized heroism and sacrifice. Modern authors often focus on hubris and the limits of technology. Some works portray Franklin as a tragic hero, others as a flawed leader whose decisions doomed his men. The story contains enough ambiguity to support multiple interpretations. The environmental and ethical questions raised by the expedition remain relevant. Franklin's crew attempted to impose their culture and methods on an environment where neither belonged. They refused to adopt Inuit survival strategies, clinging to European ways even when those ways proved inadequate. Their failure offers lessons about the importance of adapting to new environments, respecting local knowledge, and recognizing the limits of technology and human control. The lead poisoning that contributed to the disaster has modern parallels. Environmental contamination, industrial materials with hidden dangers, inadequate safety testing, these issues resonate today just as they did in the 1,840 seconds. The tinned food that poisoned Franklin's crew was a cutting-edge technology that proved to have fatal flaws, a reminder that progress can carry unforeseen costs. The fate of Franklin's men also speaks to universal human experiences: isolation, desperation, the struggle to survive against overwhelming odds, the bonds between people facing hardship together. Though most of us will never face Arctic cold or starvation, we can imagine the fear, the hope, the gradual loss of strength, and the final acceptance of death. The Franklin expedition puts us in touch with fundamental aspects of human existence. The search for Franklin also tells its own story. The decades of effort, the dozens of expeditions, the refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed irrational. All of this speaks to human persistence and the bonds of loyalty and love. Lady Franklin's determination to learn her husband's fate, her funding of multiple search expeditions, her public campaigning, and her refusal to accept uncertainty make her as much a part of the story as Franklin himself. The modern discoveries have brought new closure, but also new questions. We can see the ships, touch the artifacts, and stand where Franklin's men stood, but we cannot fully know their experiences, cannot hear their voices, cannot understand what it was like to watch hope fade day by day in the frozen Arctic. The mystery is partially solved but will never be completely resolved. Eternal silence. Tonight, more than 175 years after HMS Erebus and HMS Terror departed London, the Arctic remains much as it was. Ice still grips the channels through which Franklin attempted to sail. The wind still howls across King William Island, scouring the landscape where his men died. The cold still tests anyone who ventures into these remote waters. The wrecks of Erebus and Terror sit quietly on the seabed, preserved by the same cold water that makes the region so inhospitable. They are monuments to ambition, to courage, and to the harsh reality that nature cannot be conquered through confidence and technology alone. They remind us that the world contains places that remain indifferent to human desire, spaces where our plans and hopes mean nothing against the fundamental forces of ice, wind, and isolation. The remains of Franklin's crew, those that were found and those that still lie undiscovered, rest in the Arctic landscape. Some are marked, remembered, honored. Others are known only to the ice and stone that surround them. Each was a person with a life, a family, dreams, and fears. Each died far from home in circumstances of unimaginable hardship. Each deserves to be remembered, not just as a statistic in a disaster, but as an individual who faced death with whatever courage, dignity, or desperation they could muster. The Franklin expedition achieved a kind of immortality through its failure. A successful voyage would have been celebrated and then forgotten, one more achievement in the long history of exploration. But the complete mystery of its disappearance, followed by the gradual heartbreaking revelation of the truth, created a story that has endured for generations. We remember Franklin and his men precisely because of how completely they vanished, how terrible their fate, and how long it took to learn the truth. The story also reminds us of the cost of exploration. Every mapped coastline, every scientific discovery, every expansion of human knowledge has been purchased with sacrifice. Franklin's men died for the Northwest Passage, a route that would eventually be navigated, but that proved far less commercially valuable than imagined. Their sacrifice contributed to understanding the Arctic, but that understanding came at a price in human lives that seems, in retrospect, terribly high. Yet we should not forget that these men chose their fate, not the disaster itself, but the decision to explore, to push boundaries, to venture into unknown regions. They were volunteers, driven by duty, ambition, curiosity, or economic necessity. They knew exploration carried risks. What they could not have known was that those risks would prove fatal for every single one of them. The Arctic that defeated Franklin is changing in our time. Climate change is warming the region, melting ice that has persisted for millennia, opening channels that were impassable in Franklin's era. The Northwest Passage that cost so many lives to explore is now becoming navigable, not through human ingenuity but through environmental transformation. There is bitter irony in this, that Franklin's goal is being achieved not by courage or technology but by climate change. As the ice melts, more evidence of the Franklin expedition may emerge. Artifacts still lie buried in permafrost and ice, Bodies still rest in locations unknown. The ships themselves may yield more secrets, as technology allows deeper and more thorough investigation. The story is not over, even after 175 years. The Arctic continues to reveal its secrets, slowly, grudgingly, on its own timeline. But some questions will never be answered. We will never know the last words spoken aboard Erebus or Terror. We will never fully understand the decisions made during those final, desperate months. We will never experience what those men experienced, the grinding daily reality of cold, hunger, isolation, and fading hope. These things are lost to time, preserved only in the silent testimony of bones, artifacts, and ships that rest where they fell. The Franklin expedition remains one of history's most compelling mysteries, not because we lack information, we actually know quite a lot, but because the human dimension cannot be fully recovered. We can reconstruct the what, the where, and the when. We can make educated guesses about the how and the why, but we can never fully grasp the who, the individual human beings who lived through this disaster, who made choices under impossible conditions, who died one by one in the frozen north. As you settle into rest tonight, let the story of Franklin and his men remind you of both human courage and human limits. These were capable, confident men who believed they could overcome the Arctic through preparation and determination. They were wrong, but their failure was not for lack of trying. They endured years of hardship, maintained discipline and civilization under conditions that would have broken many, and faced death with whatever strength remained to them. The Arctic wind still blows across King William Island, just as it did when Franklin's men struggled south toward a safety they would never reach. The ice still forms and breaks, following patterns older than human history. The northern lights still dance in the winter sky over a landscape empty of human presence. The Arctic endures, vast and indifferent, keeping some secrets while slowly revealing others. The Franklin expedition sailed into mystery and never returned. Their story, frozen in time like the landscape that claimed them, teaches us about ambition and hubris, courage and desperation, the bonds of human fellowship, and the limits of human endurance. It reminds us that some places remain beyond our complete control, that nature operates on scales that make human plans irrelevant, and that death can come even to the best prepared among us. Thank you for journeying through the Franklin expedition with me tonight. As you drift into sleep, let the haunting stillness of the Arctic, the slow drift of ice, and the quiet mystery of those frozen waters carry you gently into rest. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts about this enduring mystery. Now take a deep breath, let the chill fade, and drift peacefully into sleep, remembering those who ventured into the unknown and never returned.